welcome. I am Tawana Black, and I'm the CEO and founder of the Center for Economic Inclusion, and I could not be more happy to have each of you here with us for our first in a series called Powering Inclusion. Why Powering Inclusion? Because we feel at the center that while inclusion is a word that we talk about quite a bit in our region and quite a bit even in our country, it's a word that requires intentionality, action, and sometimes a little bit of fuel, and we intend to be that fuel, an organization that is relentlessly committed to creating and catalyzing an economy that truly works for everyone. And we're excited to kick off this panel, not just the panel discussion, but actually to kick off this event series to be able to begin powering inclusion in our region, and specifically to begin powering economic inclusion. For those of you who are new to the center, who may not have been to our kickoff event in May and maybe haven't had time to be able to meet any of our team members, I want to talk just briefly about the center. What is it? You've got a brochure on your chairs, but what is this Center for Economic Inclusion who is hosting this event? The center is a cross-sector organization that is designed regionally, that has been designed by people across the region who believe that despite many great efforts, many great programs and initiatives and organizations who are committed to the ideals of inclusion, the ideals of having an economy that works together, that we continue to be a region that struggles with getting together, not unlike many places across the country, but unique to this particular place, that we continue to be a place that has those ideals and yet struggles with getting past approaching that work from more than a charity perspective, that struggles from being able to actually take on the market drivers that get in the way of economic inclusion, that get in the way of making sure that everyone in our region is actually prospering in such a prosperous region. But we also believe that it's possible. We believe that it's possible to take the reins of our market, to take the reins of each one of our sectors and begin to align and realign in such a way that we do achieve that inclusive economy. And we believe that we have to. Not only because there are people in our community that are hurting, because that would be reason enough, but also because the economy is hurting entirely too much. And because this region can't continue to go on the way that it is right now, or it'll hurt all of us. In fact, it's hurting all of us right now, but unfortunately, it's hard to see it. It's hard to see it beyond the reports that come out. It's hard to see it on a daily basis, and then it's hard to know exactly what to do. In walks the Center for Economic Inclusion, not as saviors, not as people who are smarter than everybody else, but as people who are committed to accountability, people who are committed to bringing all of us together and believe that it takes all of us, that there isn't one sector who can solve for, whether it's the workforce disparities that we have, the wage disparities and inequities that we have, the health disparities and inequities, the education disparities and inequities, you name it, you pick one for the day. There isn't one sector that can solve for those, that there isn't one group of people who can solve for those, there isn't one accountability system that can solve for those, but that together we can begin to craft some different strategies and approaches, and that together we can hold each other accountable in different ways and be accountable ultimately to the community, to communities of people who we all come together and talk about and work about, but don't often work with, in order to create that inclusive economy, and ultimately that our entire fabric as Minnesotans is dependent on it. Today of all days, we kick off this series on quite an interesting week if you think about the timing of this. It is Startup Week. Many great announcements have already taken place in our region this week alone, and many more will come. We're excited about that work and excited about the companies who have announced already this week that they are going to call Minnesota home. It is also a day when St. Paul, our very own St. Paul mayor and council members, have announced that they are moving forward with an ordinance for $15 minimum wage. Moving forward to see that that happens in a way that is equitable. Yes, indeed. Moving forward with that ordinance in a way that is St. Paul driven. Having spent time hearing from residents, hearing from business owners, hearing from business leaders, studying what has worked and what has not worked in other communities across not only this state, but others. And indeed, just a day ago, we celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day, being a state that led the country in saying no longer Columbus Day, but Indigenous Peoples Day. And so as we bring you together for this first Powering Inclusion series, we decided to start this by focusing on some work that we've been doing in our own organization in supporting our cities and thinking about the future of our cities and communities in land use planning, in economic development planning, and how we invest in our infrastructure in order to sustain and grow our economies. We at the Center for Economic Inclusion have been partnering with the Metropolitan Council in many cities throughout the region to think differently about what our region should look like by 2040. And we were excited to be able to bring our featured speaker here today to be able to talk about what it takes for cities to go about their planning and their investments and their action to ensure that that planning is not just planning, but that ultimately that planning results in the communities we envision. So as I thought about what we just celebrated yesterday, I thought about what it requires, how it requires us to go back to the very beginning. If you want to write the future, you must go back and write the past. Writing the past requires knowing the past. As a person who is not Minnesotan by nature, who was not born here, I admit myself, I've got a lot of learning to do. And I would venture to say that most of us in the room probably have a lot of learning to do. But it's important, it's imperative even, that all of us take the time to do that learning as we think about what we want our future to look like, what we need our future to look like, and indeed what is possible for our future to look like. Is it possible for everyone in our region to experience the prosperous, growing, and vibrant economy that so many do? Is it possible for everyone to have a home that is safe and secure, thriving? Is it prosperous for every child to live in a neighborhood that is safe and growing and prosperous, where the amenities are flowing, where they can trust that other people are looking out for them as much as they're looking out for their own? Those are questions that require us to go backwards and think about decisions that we've made so that those who sit in our seats in 50 and 100 years, when they look backwards, they see the story that we want them to see about the decisions that we made. So I'm excited to be able to kick off today with a speaker who's going to challenge us to think about what we know about the decisions we make. What do we believe about the decisions we make? We talk about data-driven decisions in our organization a lot, and questioning the data that we trust, the data that we don't know, and the data that we must go get. I'm excited to tell you that our speaker is bringing forth more and more and more data in the organization that he's been a part of to help us question some of the assumptions that we so quickly gather a part of, and the panelists who will come behind him will help us question that even more, but more than that, will help us begin to double down on our commitment, not just to the words economic inclusion, not just to the words shared prosperity, but to the real ideals that stand behind them. So at this time, I will introduce to you our speaker. Dr. Andre Perry is a David M. Rubenstein Fellow in the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, where his research focuses on race and structural inequality, education, and economic inclusion. Of particular note is his recent scholarship at Brookings has analyzed majority Black places and institutions in America, focusing on highlighting valuable assets worthy of increased investment. Now that's what the paper says about him, and you can Google things in this day and age to read lots more about him. What I will tell you about him is, having spent quite a bit of time with some colleagues of his at Brookings Metropolitan Institute, having spent time with them before his arrival, I will tell you that he's a change maker of the best type, who's willing to come in with bold truths, but with the data and facts to back them up. I'll tell you that he's someone who has spent time in this region, time working with educators, time working with policymakers, and loves and likes this region. So as he shocks you, don't forget that he loves and likes this region a little bit too. I will also tell you that he's a doting father and likes to be able to smile a lot while doting on that son, so that if you follow him on Twitter, you'll get to see that much. And I will tell you that I am excited to be able to welcome him not only to our stage, but also to our region. Please help me welcome right now Dr. Andre Perry to the stage.
Thank you. Wow. My. Man, that was impressive. Thank you for having me, Tawana. But my. Have you seen the Rondo community lately? Has it developed? The neighborhood that policymakers literally split apart, where the highway has become the destination site for people learning about economic inclusion. People are flocking to see a pioneering business corridor that provides affordable commercial space for firms in both high-growth and local service industries. Many of those firms emerged from an incubator focused on developing founders of color that's located on the same strip. The physical construction of the corridor is a prototype for how opportunity zone investments can include minority investment firms, meet disadvantaged business participation goals, and incorporate workforce training programs. The corridor models how investors can reap financial returns from the benefits of inclusion. You have to see how investors bank on Rondo for inclusion. All throughout the corridor, you can smell the sweet aroma of freshly baked cookies that a new bakery prepared for children throughout the region. The bakery signed a contract with the school district to make lunches for half of its elementary schools. Distracted parents and other pedestrians can't resist and enter the storefront to purchase muffins and Java for their commute to work and or school. You have to smell how business develops in Rondo. In the mornings, just a few blocks away from the corridor, children and parents can be seen shuffling in and out of a new, handsome elementary school. The question of will you send your child to a public school isn't analogous to Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac. The choice is not personal, it's collective. The neighborhood chooses to walk to school together. The school's teachers add to the colorful procession, reflecting the diverse talent that MSP has to offer. Veteran teachers walk a little bit more efficiently than their eager 20-something-year-old counterparts, but they walk in together. And through a public-private partnership between the Black-led technology firm Opportunity Hub and Minneapolis Community and Technical College, coding academies were established in each high school. These academies help train teachers and students and adults the fundamentals of coding. Free after-school summer boot camps give teachers opportunities to expand their curricula and the students the prospects of attaining in-demand certifications. You have to see people learning how to do inclusion in Rondo. The school facility was built through an ambitious statewide infrastructure program that included regional construction projects led by Thor Construction. Thor employed participants of a work-based learning program through a local community college that was designed to train and certify low-skilled workers seeking entry into the workforce. Participants were trained in foundation work, wall mounting, column assembly, as well as beams, plates, and finishing work. You have to see how residents learn on the job in Rondo. After dropping children off at school, parents and other workers then stride their way to the revamped metro system, which now bridges all neighborhoods of MSP with the work centers of the region. After the Amazon HQ2 competition ended, mayors in the region played their own game. They opened up a competition to minority-led firms to submit plans to rethink train and bus routes. Those plans included the light rail going through and stopping in North Minneapolis. All students, including collegians, ride for free in this new system, giving them access to all of the after-school and work opportunities the city affords. You have to see how transportation fosters inclusion from Rondo to North Minneapolis. In North Minneapolis, the city adopted a renter's bill of rights that was the basis of a new inclusive zoning policy. The goal of decreasing the number of predatory landlords went hand in hand with an effort to convert renters into homeowners. The inclusive zoning policy expanded affordable housing in the region, making it easier for families to live closer to quality jobs and homes. You have to see how inclusion lives in MSP. When the final bell rings at school, every child has a home to return to. Working parents are not in poverty, and non-working families are in school. Aftercare comes in the form of free citywide after-school initiatives, libraries, museums, as well as sports and arts programs. Parents rendezvous with their children after work to close out the day with a good meal and a good night's rest. Children and parents dream of the day to follow. You have to believe in Rondo. You have to believe in North Minneapolis. More importantly, you have to believe in the power of inclusion. I wanted to begin with a vision of what can be. Because typically when we talk about inclusion, we're typically talking about problems, gaps to be closed, in which blacks and brown folk are on the bottom end of that ledger. We also are not used to giving a positive vision because we're constantly devaluing people of color, and that is the nature of my work. We devalue people and places. I'm going to show you some data. This is a chart that shows as the percent of black folk in a neighborhood goes up, the price of the home goes down. So, this is the national average. Black neighborhoods where blacks represent 0 to 1%, their homes are generally worth $341,000. Where blacks make up 50% or more, about approximately $185,000. Now, many of you will say, well, that's because of the home quality and the education environment, and crime is causing those prices to drop. Well, we can control for that. So what we did was we created a model, an empirical model, where we controlled for a number of these structural characteristics, years built, number of rooms, the bedrooms. We also looked at local school quality, crime, walkability, public access to transit. We controlled for all those things. So essentially we found equivalent homes. The difference is you have some in black neighborhoods surrounded by black folk and some in white neighborhoods. And what do you think we found? Still, there was a 25% difference in price, and essentially that amounts to $160 billion lost in lost revenues. Those monies could have been used to start a business, to send your kid to college, to revitalize your neighborhood. I just want to give you, but this is the thing we don't see, but many of these places also have things that are desirable. The walkability index of places where blacks live is better than those where white folks live. In addition, those who use public transportation is generally better in those places. There are assets in black communities we can build upon. Just want to give you a sense of how homes are devalued. Colorado Springs homes in black neighborhoods are 83% less. 83% less. Rochester, New York, 70%. But let's go to Minneapolis, 20% less. Not because of the structure, not because of the education, not because of crime, because of us. Because we devalue black people. And that devaluation is thrust upon our property, our leadership, our businesses. This is just a metaphor. I use housing. Yes, we also do business. But I can extend this to leadership, to education, to a number of areas. We devalue people and places. In order for us to change our perspective, we need investment. There is no other way to change this scenario than to invest in people of color. The way that, in general, white folks value black folk is whether or not we're going to invest in them, which we have not. And so my work is around figuring out, okay, where are those places and communities that are worthy of investment to give folks an opportunity to invest in them? Because what this shows you is that there's nothing wrong with black assets, nothing wrong with them. Those are actually opportunities for growth. That's where the opportunity lies. And I can actually make an argument that we are inflating value in white communities, on homes, on businesses, on leadership. And so if you're trying to make a shrewd investment, understand that you got to consider your devaluation. So I'm going to move forward. I just want to be clear about this, and I'm putting this up here in tweet form so you can tweet these too. Right? So please get on your Twitter handle. Inclusion isn't a side hustle. We can combat racism and make money at the same time. I actually, in my work around inclusion, I hear when it comes to talking about making people of color money, I hear we shouldn't, we can't, we don't have capacity, we're not ready, this organization is not built for that. I hear all kinds of excuses. But when we talk about generally white folks making money, it's about innovation, drive, moonshots. Let's do something different, right? When in fact, what's interesting, you can actually make money because these are the areas of opportunity. What Thor did in terms of moving the corporation on the north side wasn't a sympathy move. That's a money move. That's where opportunity exists. But we keep thinking about investments into black communities as helping people out instead of making them money, yourselves money. But more importantly, I don't do this work so that white folks can get, I'm not making a head case for white folks to understand the opportunities. This is actually, my work is for people of color to understand their value. My favorite play in all the world is Two Trains Running. In that play, the main character, Memphis, is about to have his business taken over through eminent domain from the city of Pittsburgh. To make a long story short, they built the Civic Arena in the Hill District. They're going to purchase his restaurant through eminent domain for $15,000. The main character, Memphis, says, I'm not selling my property, I know my price. And throughout the play, he goes back and forth with this city, I know my price. There's another character, Hambone. Hambone in the story does work for another business leader for a ham. He never gets his ham. He goes back and forth with the business owner until he goes insane and later on dies. The play actually has a happy ending. Memphis, the main character, gets $30,000 more than what he asked for. The moral of the story is clear, that you must know your price. You must know that you have worth. You must know that you have value. Everything I do in terms of the analytics I give is so that people can know their price. Know that they have value. Know that you have to stand on it, even if you're going to go crazy, because one, you're not crazy. I typically say there's nothing wrong with black people that ending racism can't solve. Your home, your leadership is worth more than what you're told. In fact, if you really want to understand that people know that your homes, your leadership, your property is worth more than what they're saying, so that they can acquire it. But my whole purpose is not necessarily to convince white folk that you should give, because I generally think that leads to charity. But these are legitimate business opportunities that we have amongst ourselves through inclusion. And this is one of the reasons why people of color develop just like white people do. through deliberate investment. You know, I know no other way than to have someone start a business, develop educationally, to develop personally, than to have some kind of input and some kind of investment that will lead to development. If there's no investment, there's no growth. What we've seen in the housing example, there's investments just lost on black, and so it's not surprising we get certain outcomes. But we've got to get through this idea that the state of America today, as a result of sort of this individual individual issues that folks need to pull themselves up by a bootstrap, blah, blah, blah. Nah, there's a lot more at play. And I'm actually a big proponent of agency. But when you look at just housing alone, the billions robbed from your devaluation. And I mean this, when I looked at the bus routes, it's clear. When you take a bus route around or a train, a light rail around a community, that's devaluation. When the assessor says, no, that property's worth less, that's devaluation. It occurred at an individual level. It occurred at a structural level. We constantly devalue quality assets, quality people. I'm teeing this up. Why this is important to me, it always goes back home, right? This woman right here, call her Mom, Elsie Mae Boyd is her name. When I was born, and this is how the story goes, or how it was told to me. When I was born, my mother had troubles. And so she took in me after I was born, the day I was born, from McGee's Women's Hospital in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Later on, the guy in the middle came along with me. 2 years later, my younger brother came along with me. Throughout my childhood, she took in 12 to 15 kids of varying durations, right? White kids, black kids. Her and her daughter took care of us. Now, when I first got to college, I forgot one point. Later on, when I was 8, the reason why she did this young man, is my father. He was eventually murdered in prison in Jackson State Penitentiary outside of Detroit. And when I was 8, I did not meet him. But he used to be a pharmaceutical salesman. He used to run drugs, hustling. But I went to Allegheny College in Meadville, Pennsylvania, and one of the first classes I took, I read the Moynihan Report. And I don't know if you remember, it was essentially the report that set the blueprint for stating that marriage behavior causes poverty, right? And I remember going, that can't be true. That's impossible, because I literally didn't have a mother, and this woman took care of all these children. Without her, where would I be? You know, the reason why I bring this up, how we measure value, how we say who's important, is all built to protect white folks for keeping their power. It makes no sense to say that her behavior, my mother's behavior, set me up for failure. Absolutely, it's insane. We've always known that we've had multiple family structures predicated on environmental conditions. You know, it's not that not being married makes you poor. It's that when you're wealthy, it's a lot more likely you'll get married. you protect assets. A lot more likely. So my point is, and this is one of the messages I just wanted to leave today, is one, know your worth. Know your value. If you're not, you will always allow someone else to dictate who you should be, what your goals should be, where you should head. You know, Rondo can be something special, but we have got to demand our price. North Minneapolis can do amazing things that we have got to demand our price at the end of the day. So with that said, I'm going to leave it there. And I'm going to have Tawana come up and introduce our esteemed panel who we're going to talk about this important issue. Thank you very much.
Knowing your worth and demanding that worth falls in line with many of the principles that we have, not only within the center, but also the principles that we have within this region, and yet probably causes a little bit of angst, a little bit of consternation. Wait a minute, what does that mean? What does that mean for me? What does that mean about me and my ability to value people? If I think that I am in a place where I value all people the same, and I've heard this presentation, what does that mean when I think about how talent is engaged in our region? Is it possible that two things can be true at the same time? Is it possible that we can all be valuing everybody and yet continue to have the drastic gaps in not only things like employment and wages, but the way that people experience our region? When we survey people of color who not only move to the region, but are native to the region, about how they experience our neighborhoods and our communities, is it possible that we can have that value and yet have people who would say, wait, I don't feel so valued at many tables? As I heard that speech, even as the CEO of the Center for Economic Inclusion, who finds herself in many envied rooms, I thought about that speech as directly to Tawana Ann Black. Know your worth. Are you demanding your worth? Are you holding people who espouse deep commitment to you, let alone economic inclusion, responsible and accountable for doing that? And if so, what does that even look like? We're going to move to commitments at the end of today, so I want you to hold those thoughts in mind as you meet our panelists, individuals who are doing the work, who are not only talking about the work, but who are walking along every day. We describe in our organization that we don't believe it just takes being at collaborative tables to do this work. We don't think it just means joining organizations or signing up for boards, but we believe it takes being arm in arm every day, both with likely allies and unlikely allies, with people who say the things we want them to say and who say the things we wish they had never said, in order to get to an economy that works for all of us. And the friends we have invited to join me on the stage right now are doing just that. I'm going to give them an opportunity to tell you a little bit about who they are and what they do as they come on stage. Our friends are bringing chairs up right now for them to join me on the stage. But these are folks who are working right now in organizations in each of the sectors, and we felt like it was important to do that so that you got a taste of what does it take to do this work from a seat of philanthropy? What does it take to do this work from a seat of engaging people in a particular community, a particular ethnic community, but who are sitting in different sectors, who come at the work of building equity and power and economics and community and neighborhoods from different angles, who want to see power shift yesterday, not tomorrow, and yet know that it takes time to build infrastructure. Many of them are working in coalition with one another at the same time that they're trying to work in coalition within their own organizations. Others are working to cut deals as it relates to land assembly and land development, business development inside their own organizations while they're trying to help other businesses develop themselves. Because ultimately, that's what we do. People of color have not had the luxury of saying, I'm gonna have one job. We joke about it a lot, but at the end of the day, after a couple of jobs, it's not very funny, actually. And yet it is what's required to do this work and shift into an inclusive economy. And so I am proud to be able to welcome our panelists to the stage. Would you all join me now that we have chairs set up? Would you hand me that iPad, please? Thank you much. Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Got it.
Oh, thanks. Thank you.
Why not, man? I've learned my way.
Awesome. You go there. Welcome here. Awesome. So we are just going to have a dialogue as though I told them, as though we were sitting in my living room, just chatting it up. And you all can play along, and then you can talk to them more as we finish up. So panelists, can I say Andre?
Yeah, good.
Awesome. Thank you. Dr. Perry and Andre shared a quote that he also tweeted this weekend that I found really powerful about how often when we're talking about being able to improve communities of color, any of them, we hear the can'ts, the shouldn'ts, the why we can't, all of the issues around capacity, and we hear those as restrictions, and yet when we have conversations about regional inclusive growth, business development, startup week, we hear innovation, opportunity, make it happen, and resources seem to be able to flow quite quickly. Why is that? What's happening? And do you see that happening in our region? And I'll open it up for just like we're in the living room, everybody jump in.
So, my name is Jai Winston. I'm with the Knight Foundation, and I'll start with, one of the things that, I had the fortunate opportunity to take this training seminar in Canada, and kind of alluded to this, but asset framing. So when we go into these marginalized communities, when we're talking about, making investments, do we come in there and we say, what is one thing that you really enjoy in a community that you want to see improved? And starting at that baseline instead of saying, oh, well, you guys have a poor educational system, so we're going to try to change that. So I think it's really important because that comes from an empowerment. And when you come in and you're engaging with an individual in that fashion, it's showing actually you have that deep investment in terms of wanting to actually help them. And so when you lead from a negative perspective, it's already letting them know that you think less of them. So I think it's really important to be mindful of just the language that you're using to engage, although it's coming, it's well-meaning, but a lot of times we could actually be harming these individuals in that context.
From a research perspective, this constant need to compare people of color to white folk makes absolutely no sense. I mean, just from a wealth perspective, one, black folk were not able to reap benefits that housing policy restricted us from having. And so when we talk about the middle class and building the middle class, I could easily argue that there really isn't a black middle class compared to whites because we couldn't acquire the wealth that came along with home ownership. And so, but yet the conversation is always, look at blacks compared to whites, look at Asians compared to whites, look at Asians compared to blacks, Latinos, and so on. But all of our histories are rooted in fundamentally different policy paths. And so my work, what I do is make sure that I nuance the economic trajectories, especially to each region, because as you could see in that one chart around assets, blacks and their relationship to assets are a much different situation on the West Coast than it is, or in the West, I should say, than in the Midwest in the East, where segregation really stifled ability to acquire goods in the main. So, but from a research perspective, we're constantly looking at blacks compared to white. And I'll just, we mentioned this on the break. I can't stand the idea of full employment. I think it's like the worst concept ever. Because one, because in the aggregate, full employment largely determined by unemployment rates. You can have national unemployment rates of whatever, 3.7%, and blacks, which historically have been double that. So you raise interest rates and burden the people who are essentially sacrificial lambs of the full employment. That, so it's just okay for that population to have high unemployment as long as the rest of us are okay. You know, and that kind of metric, that kind of framing is indicative in education, in housing, in you name it, that we got to figure out the standards that we're going to hold ourselves to that are much different than this easy comparison of whites to blacks.
And it's interesting to add to that. So the largest wealth building tool in the United States ever was under the Federal Housing Administration with the GI Bill, and less than 2% of African Americans received loans to be able to purchase houses. So now when we talk about being able to compound that interest over the course of 60 years and being able to have that as something to pass on to your family, and then we have that conversation about why are people of color at such a disadvantage, because we never got an opportunity to participate in opportunities like those.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, just going back to your first point, Tawana, about just how do we talk about people of color and who are we comparing them to, right? I feel like when I'm talking about the Asian American community, people expect me to be able to talk about all people of color, right? So they're like, well, how do they compare to this community? And it's not, and what I'm really trying to just say is, aren't we talking about raising the ceiling, right, for everyone? And so it should not be my burden to then compare how my community is doing with other communities of color, because you're making it a race to the bottom, right? So it's like I have to justify that unless I can show some indicator that we are worse off than whatever, then we are not deserving, right? So I think, we live in a country where race is systematized, and that is the relationship in which we are engaging people who have a desire to make sure that their communities can have, health and prosperity. And then when we ask communities for their ideas, we're asking them to make it about being a race to the bottom, right? In particular, indigenous and communities of color. And so I do find that hard, and we make decisions as an organization to say, it is not our job to give you the data on every other community, right? You wanna know that? You gotta go find it. We're here to talk about this community, and to talk about what it looks like in this specific community, and then let's engage, right? Because we want those adjectives to be descriptors of our communities as well, instead of saying, are you more deserving than somebody who is doing worse, when actually what we're talking about is ultimately we all lose because of racism, right?
I'm really struck by the narrative that you said there, and I'm going to come back to you, but just
Yeah.
as you described the piece around knowing your worth, and then this call that we often have to say, okay, describe your community, and not just describe your community, but describe it compared to all these other communities who are also struggling, and that notion of the race to the bottom. And I have a colleague who's a grant writer on the East Coast who said, she had about a year ago, said I had to give it up because I had noticed it over and over and over by grant makers. I'm being asked to describe the work I do in the communities that I'm serving in the most horrible ways. You want me to spend 2 pages telling you everything horrible about these communities, and then half a page telling you what I'm going to do to build up their assets. This is sickening. Like she said, I'm physically sick by writing grant application after grant application about work that I know is valuable and I know needs to be done, but to funders who say they're aligned with my values, but who write their grant applications in such a way where I need to tell you just how horrible and broke down, let me go scrape the bottom and then tell you just a little bit about the assets and how I'm going to build from those assets, when I really know I could write you a book about the assets and why I need resources to be able to flip that script upside down and focus on those assets, but we don't do that. I'm really struck by you mentioning that race to the bottom and what we have to do about that, so I don't want to lose that.
Go ahead, go.
I'm Marcus Owens, the Executive Director at the African American Leadership Forum. So kind of to that point, I mean, it's a zero-sum game for us to do this comparison constantly within our community. And when we ask who is the comparison for? Are we talking to the majority culture, or are we talking to our own communities, right? In our own communities, we don't talk about ourselves in comparison to anybody, right? And so when we have these grant applications, or we talk about our communities, and when we start with deficit, that puts our mindset down, it puts our belief systems down, it puts a sense of ownership down, so it does devalue us in a sense that we will never know our price because we constantly think about how bad it is for us here. And then how bad it for us is for the people that you think about economic issues, it even trickles all the way up to the people that are actually doing good. They are doing good economically, but still have the same belief that we're not doing good here in Minnesota, right? We're not doing good across the country, which then doesn't allow us for this space to start thinking about innovation and thinking about creation and thinking about what we actually want, the assets that we actually have and that we can start to build on. So when we go into these conversations with investors, whether it be on the philanthropy side or it goes into the private side, they're looking at us because they've been constantly fed this deficit narrative. And so how do we shift that so that we can actually have the conversation about, okay, what do you want to do? How do you want your community to look? Because the other part of that is when you have this deficit mindset and this lack of asset, they're already making plans what they want to do for our communities versus including us in the inclusion part of developing community together. So this whole notion of how we talk about the numbers really it has to start with the asset base so we can actually get to find a way. How are we going to do this? Innovation, great. Would you say moonshot? Moonshot. Those type of things because there's people in our community that have those ideas and they want that tangible thing to say, finally, someone's listening to me the way that I want to talk about it.
So I'm Ravi Norman, CEO of Thor Companies. Language, it really is important, but most of the philosophy stuff that has worked for me in my life has come from my grandmother. And so she used to tell me when I was really young, when my cousins used to say things, she used to say, and you probably could finish this for me, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Why did I think that was important? Because she always used to tell me, boy, spend as much time on people's behavior as you do on what's coming out of their mouths. Because the truth of the matter is, you're in a culture in Minnesota that talks about Minnesota nice. And Minnesota nice means that those words like can't and shouldn't and won't maybe show up in the dialogue, but it is how people feel. So you better have a keen assessment and an acute assessment of people's action and behavior, even more than what you're worried about as a relative to their words. My second point is, I don't know if anybody's familiar with Paulo Freire, the Brazilian activist and economist. He wrote a book called The Pedagogy of Oppression. And in that concept, he talks about that paradigm of oppression, and almost never is pedagogies of oppression transformed by the oppressor. By that I'm saying, those folks in power and privilege oftentimes are not going to be the ones to create a structural model for transformation. And I think to your point, Dr. Perry, a lot of times that giving process comes through in charity. And so my concepts are, if we first and foremost want to talk about how we innovate, how we moonshot, how we do this, then black and brown communities that exist in our region have to first model our behavior together. Because if we're not going to model the behavior together about how this is supposed to work, we're going to be busy asking for charity. And I'm not interested in it. So for me, it's what are we doing together first to be real about the asset, not just to map it, but to live it.
Just to add on to that, and I didn't talk about the role of philanthropy, but, philanthropy has to play a role in all this. Philanthropy, private investment, public investment, because all those things help get us there. But if we're not driving towards a model of creating owners in businesses, owners of homes, owners of things, then we're really not trying to change the conditions in our communities, particularly for African Americans. Our battle has always been around moving from a lack of control of our own bodies to owning all the assets around us, including education, homes, and things like that. And so philanthropy does need to start to move towards investing in getting people to own different things. Now, I'm a big fan of incubators for a couple of reasons. incubators do allow what we call, safe space to think, to share resources. And in many neighborhoods of color, we do need that space because the incubator world outside it's generally hostile. They have many of the stereotypes of black and brown folk. So we do need place-based initiatives where we have incubators or any kind of space where folks can actually build things. And that's where I think philanthropy can play an important role because one, and you talk about professionals, when we talk about professional service supports, the lack of wealth. Yes, we may have to get the capital to start a business, but we don't have the resources for lawyers and all the other supports. And so what I think incubators do is they give us a safe place, and it might be an accelerator, but they can also give the supports that not having the wealth would afford you otherwise.
And I'm going to take it a little step further, being with a philanthropic institution. Yeah. So one of the things that we talk about internally, so it's great that we're investing in these communities of color, but more importantly, are we working with these communities of color in this context of working with minority-owned firms in the professional services area? So as Knight Foundation, we have a $2.4 billion endowment, and 1/3 of that is actually managed by minority-owned money management firms. But when you think about, so we give away 5% of our endowment annually, so that's about $160 million that we're investing in these communities of color. However, at a $2.4 billion endowment, that means that money managers are managing $500 million, $750 million, $1 billion of our dollars. And so that's really where the real wealth is being created and generated. And if we're not giving those opportunities to minority-owned firms to be our accountants, to be our attorneys, to be our money managers, we're really not making the intentional investment in trying to invest in these communities. And so it's great that you're investing, $160 million annually in these communities, but it also needs to be on the flip side in terms of how we're doing a business externally with professionals, professional services. And then I think even when it comes to the whole incubator aspect of it too, we've been able to have the fortunate opportunity to work with American Public Media to make an investment in downtown St. Paul in what's called the Glenn Nelson Center. And out of that, they run a program called Lunar Startups. And ignorantly myself, when I first came to the Twin Cities, I thought one of the challenges for entrepreneurs was that they just needed the capital. And while that is extremely important, they need more than just the capital, they need the wraparound services. So a lot of times people of color don't inherently have the aunt, cousin, uncle who's an attorney or an accountant, et cetera. And I think you guys being, Minnesotans may be familiar with the young lady who won the Minnesota Cup a few years ago with the athletic hijab. And 6 months or 8 months later, Nike comes out with that. If she had the resources in the network just to say, hey, make sure this is trademarked and patented, et cetera, she could have either sold that to Nike or she could have partnered with them. And then when you talk about building wealth for her community, that would have allowed her to be able to hire people from her community who look like her. So I think that intentionality has to be there in terms of nonprofits and foundation institutions not only talking about investing in these communities of color, but also doing business with these communities of color, and not just in the commodity space of food and beverage, but also in the professional services area.
I can't say this enough. I believe in sort of the idea of venture capital, and Arlen Hamilton, if you don't know, she's coming next month here. She'll be on the stage. You got to come see that. But the reality is that's generally play money that rich folk give to folks. But Arlen Hamilton is important because we actually do need to see more people of color managing funds. There is something powerful. One, they will generally have a more diverse portfolio of companies to invest in, more than likely. But two, there is something powerful about seeing people of color investing in communities of color, or anything for that matter. And so what I've always been hopeful, not necessarily on the venture capital going to different people or people of color, but I'm very interested in figuring out who can start a fund here, who of color can start a fund here that will do that good work. That makes a big statement about what you believe in, who sets the narrative, who controls. Because if you see nothing but white investors, you're seeing a sort of just a negative view on the world.
Yeah, can we?
Yeah, you.
Well, just because you started the
Yeah.
fun piece, so I think that was kind of an easy transition for me to talk about. I agree. I concur with everything Dr. Perry has said today, including that concept of us controlling our own fund. So much so that that's a major focus for me right now, is to get a fund off the ground in 2019, one that's very specific around opportunity zones. By a show of hands in the audience, who's familiar with opportunity zones and the tax law of 2017? Good, so everybody should familiarize themselves with it. Because to me, I think it might be the biggest tax incentive, thereby creating a huge economic impetus to invest into traditionally lower income communities or underutilized or underinvested in communities, maybe ever, depending on how this plays out. If you believe what EIG put out, they said there's $6.1 trillion of unrealized capital gains in the marketplace. 6.1 trillion with the T, unrealized capital gains that are in the marketplace. Now, by just another show of hands, who believes that in the basic investment ideology, you like to buy low and sell high? Everybody should be putting their hands up right now if you're somewhat of a savvy investor. Why is that all important? Because the way that a capital gains is actually created is you invest in something, call it for $3, and if you can sell it for its maximum piece, let's call it $10, the $7 is your gain, your capital gain. So this concept of unrealized capital gains is that there is this appreciable value in investments that have been made. Now, when do you sell? You usually sell at the peak, or try to get as close to the peak as you possibly can. So, if you believe that you've reached its peak and we're moving to a place where you're going to start getting less gain in return, you typically sell. When you sell, you recognize the capital gain. When you recognize the capital gain, the tax associated with capital gains in this country right now at a federal level is 15%. So, let's just say, if anybody's paying attention to macroeconomic stuff, and I know everybody's caught up in how great things look in the economy from Trump, but traditionally there's a little inverted curve that has been a precursor to recession, traditionally. Recession means the market's going down, which means people think, oh, my asset values might be going down. A good time to sell, right? So, if $6.1 trillion of unrealized gain is in the marketplace and people begin selling those positions, what is 15% of $6.1 trillion? $900 billion, our math whiz in the room. $900 billion. Now, just take into account that new market tax credits, which helped me do the deal in North Minneapolis, that's about $7 billion of tax credits that tend to flow through the marketplace. $900 billion of capital that can be flowing into lower income communities designated by census tract at the state level. And by the way, Governor Dayton's already put what those census tracts are in Minnesota. $900 billion. But guess what? Right now, they haven't really put out the regulations yet. It's supposed to come out this week. Maybe it'll come out in the next 30 days that are going to govern that program. But let's just take a hypothesis, right? It's coming out in the Trump administration. Does he like to fall on the heavy end of regulation or on the more deregulation side? There's another secret vote interactive piece of the, okay, pretty much doesn't like regulation, right? So most of the guide rails that people are talking about that are come out around that kind of capital, which we haven't seen flow into our markets, right? Place and timing. Place, which is already designated by where the census tract is, and you get these qualified opportunity zone funds that can take the money in to defer or protect against the gain. The other part is timing, and there are some really important pieces about timing as the capital has to be deployed and the timing of it. As of right now, though, there are no designations inside of what's going to govern the investment ideology around what happens with space in those places or race. Right. And when I talk about race, I'm saying that we've already kind of self-selected some of the race concepts in terms of where we live. So if you go up to Cedar Riverside in St. Paul, or in Cedar Riverside, guess what you're going to see? A significant amount of the population. Somalian, East Africans, immigrants there. If you went to Lake Street, what do you see? See, people, this is a good call and response piece. If you went to North Minneapolis, what do you see? It's not in the opportunity zone, but I'm just going to do it for the fun of it. In Edina? Yeah. So my point is, you can make the race conversation in this and not have to be talking about just trying to benefit a particular race because people are already self-selected there. What the race concept that needs to be synthesized into the investment ideology is the people that have lived, worked, and played in those places for long periods of time. Those should be the focuses of the assets that we're trying to develop in creating the maximum return to. This is a concept of, yes, we need to control our own funds. And oh, by the way, Minnesota also has some interesting models where the fund itself, of course, there's going to be this heavy influx of high net worth individuals that are trying to protect the gains. But there's also room in these funds that tax exempt players can be part of the ownership of the fund. There's also room, if anybody heard of Minvest? Yeah, an opportunity to be able to crowdsource and be able to get the unaccredited investor who, instead of just coming in and saying, hey, we're going to bring this capital and we're going to build all the stuff that you like, and then we're going to find a way for you to participate in the supply chain, what about them participating in the fund as part of the, if ownership matters? Because I was at a little event with Target a couple years ago, and Thomas Friedman said a line that I repeat often: nobody washes a rental car. I'm done for right now. So.
You sure?
No, but I can't say this enough.
Yeah.
Minnesota is, because of you and you're here, it's set up differently. I mean, many communities do not have a person of color that's in the mix around these opportunity zones. And so how do you maximize this opportunity in Minnesota that doesn't exist in a lot of other places? I've been critical of opportunity zones for that reason. If you're not increasing the number of fund managers, essentially, and you're essentially investing in deals that are already essentially gentrifying or hurting communities, you're just essentially doubling down on those. And so I think, Minnesota's a little bit different because you have someone who's a player. But we've got to get more fund and that's why Arlen and others are so vitally important. That mentorship, those folks who are breaking into these funding networks are very, very important. And you have assets in Minnesota that are doing that. So I think that is something that you have that other folks around the country simply do not.
So I want to play off of that a little bit. One of the other things I saw in the Twitter world this weekend, as you were tweeting, was somebody wrote back and challenged you, and you're thinking about and asked a question about the education system, and was that one to rely on? And you wrote back to say, yes, and no one sector can do this alone. And we absolutely stand in that same premise. And as we find that our cities today, as I mentioned earlier, are right in the midst of turning in their final plans that will guide the development in this region until 2040. We've got so many cities who are going about that. I would say many head down, some being very progressive. And I know your organization, Coalition for Asian American Leaders, issued a statement to Minneapolis to say, yes, great, you have goals around racial equity. One of the first to do that, to actually state clearly we are committed to racial equity, and that's great, but we must go further. We're not monolithic. It requires intentional strategy. It requires knowledge about communities and what works in some and does not work in others. And it requires partnership. What does it take, panel? What does it take for us to go about thinking about the future, but also working in the future in ways that involve everyone, in ways that deploy the assets of all sectors and all communities, and ultimately lead to equity and wealth to the conversation we've been having here?
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed our conversation before we got on the panel because we were talking about, this terminology of data-driven, right? And how when we come up with these plans, that's what gets thrown to community, right? Is that, here's the data we have about your community, and the community is pushing back saying, nope, that's not the right data, right? So how do you flip that on its head? And I think your point is really well taken, which is we should all continue to be community driven, but what does that mean, right? And so one is not to accept that any of our communities are defined by the social constructs of the racial groups that have been sort of said, this is how you fit in. Because I think for our community, the aggregate is the enemy of equity, right? Because it means that we can't ever tell a complete story, right? Or even when the data is not there, we can't say it's not there, right? So we're constantly kind of made into this monolith and aggregate and sort of saying, well, your community doesn't have problems because here's what the aggregate says. And we know that that's not true because we have in Minnesota, this community is very diverse. Asian Americans come from every part of the world. There's over 40 different ethnic groups. We know that 90% of those who are in poverty are Southeast Asians who came as refugees, but the data won't tell you that, right? And so when you look at things like household income and you're celebrating it, but actually Southeast Asians and in particular Hmong families have at least 3 earners, right? To make up that what seems like parity to whites, right? So you look at the white average household income and you look at Asians and you say, oh, they look pretty good, right? But then you look at the household size, it's 5. You have an average of 3 household earners to make up that, but that's not the data that the community gets to determine or the analysis that the community helps to contribute to, right? So we end up fighting the data instead of saying, how is it actually community-centered? And I think that this is a constant challenge, and that's why we've put forth those comments to the comp plans to say, if you really are going to center these comp plans around racial equity, you better do a much better job, right? And it really better be community-centered because otherwise you're gonna end up doing so much disservice for our communities because we're gonna, instead of working hard with you on the plans, we're fighting against you, and that's a waste of time and energy that we all don't have, right? So I think that's our constant challenge, right? About why we keep saying the data has to be richer. The community should determine the narrative that it wants to tell, the same way that it should not just value itself, but practices that don't show up in systems, right? We know that this is a community that is very poor, but they don't show up in things like homelessness. Why is that, right? It's because people take care of each other, but that's a cultural practice, but that doesn't show up in a system. Nobody gets rewarded because they're doubling up in houses, because they just say you don't have a homeless problem, right? And I say, well, we always had 2 extra cousins live with us all the way through high school, right? And I was saying, and Kristen and I had this conversation about oh, so how did you really get out of poverty? And I said, can I just be really honest with you? It's because my parents didn't follow any of the rules, right? In a way, we kind of cheated the system, right? Because we didn't report certain incomes, we didn't, but also people are able to start small businesses because they're creating their own funding circles, right? But what the problem with that is that when it doesn't show up in the system, nobody gets rewarded, right? So those are things that I think we have to actually look at, both because that is our value and our worth, and that's the practices that have allowed for us to survive, but now what does it mean for communities to actually thrive economically, right? What do systems do differently?
I'll jump in on that too. So like thinking about comp plans and thinking about all these different things that are happening within our communities need to be very smart about what's actually happening in our communities and not allowing others to kind of tell us what's happening and provide the vision. So kind of to an example around incubators and funds, I ran another organization on the north side for a few years, and we created an incubator, but with some intentionality, because what we did not understand before we started the incubation process was what is actually happening as it relates to problems and solutions in our community in the retail space. We thought, oh, we're low income, we don't have any money, therefore we don't have any demand. We don't demand anything, right? But we did a GIS study on a West Broadway corridor over in the north side and found out that there's tremendous opportunity for retail. That then lined up with what do we need to incubate in order to make that actually work so that we're actually supplying to the demand that's in the community with businesses that are from our community. Because right now we're having to leave our community to get our needs met. Okay, so that's stage one, understanding what needs do you have today in your community so that you can begin to solve or incubate ideas and put funds to those things, right? Two, then, when those businesses are actually providing for your community, and some are, we want a majority from our community providing for our community, but then there's other businesses that are providing, they're large retailers, whatever you have. They have needs too. Are you building businesses that are actually supplying the needs of those businesses so that we have this continuous cycle of we're providing the needs on the ground level, but we're also providing the needs at the mid-level, which then gives room to the third stage, which is innovation. We don't have space to think about the problems for tomorrow, to think about solutions, so that then we're actually incubating at all three stages within our community that then allows for the space for innovation and funding to get to those things. So, you know, thinking about those plans, take those plans as an opportunity to go into your community and understand actually what's happening so that you can then start to respond to it and not just come from a block it, we don't want it, but how do we actually take advantage of it ourselves?
I was just going to add to the data point. I think, again, this overarching theme of intentionality. So you think about the organizations and institutions that are mining this data, making sure that the individuals, it's not a homogenous group of people who are actually putting this data set together, but it's, you know, a diverse group of people who are able to pick up on the cultural nuances associated with different communities. And so I think that's something that's really important. And, you know, from a Knight perspective, we talk about that just in the grand scheme of technology and smart cities and, you know, the way that a lot of technology is impacting the way that we do business, and a lot of folks who are designing and creating the software in these platforms do not look like us. And so it's missing, you know, and I used an example earlier telling them about, there was something with the hand dryer. Originally, the designers who, like the hand dryers in bathrooms, you know, was designed by all, you know, white men, and so when people of color were going to get their hand dryers, it wasn't kicking on. And it's just thinking about something as simple like that, and it's so well-intentioned, but I think, again, people being intentional to make sure that they're being inclusive.
You know, I can't say this enough, the comp reports and the public sort of discourse and reporting on this, that's where communities can name their price. You know, it's in those moments where you can make demands. And yes, people of color in general, we don't have a lot of resources, but we do have the ability to speak and to write and to leverage these opportunities to demand our price. And this on data, and we talked about this, I cannot stand the phrase data-driven. I think it's always, you should be community-driven and use data to help that community. I came about, did research in education, and I used to get this question all the time: what's the fastest way to close the black-white achievement gap? You know, and they would say, oh, this and that. And I said, well, the fastest way is to stop educating white people. That's the fastest way to close the black. But we would never do that, right? We would never do that. But what we will do is fire black teachers, expel black students, do all kind of equally nefarious things. You know, yes, we can close gaps in a number of evil ways. How is the question? We can create wealth for black and brown folks in this world. How are we going to do it? That's more of the issue. The same way we created wealth through federal policy, through philanthropy, through private investment, for a number of people. We can do that for Black and brown folk. So, I mean, I can't say this. You have communities here in Minneapolis that were decimated by a federal decision to build a highway, knowing the consequences. We can be intentional about using policy to build wealth in those very same communities. These comprehensive plan opportunities, that's where you do it. That take every opportunity to share your voice about to demand your price. Because if you don't, somebody else will.
And I think going off of that point, it's so interesting. So in my previous work, I worked at an investment firm. I used to do a lot of research around like corporate governance. And it's interesting because when you talk about knowing your price, out of these Fortune 500 companies, a lot of them, the majority of them actually don't have any African-American board directors. And so, one example is, you think about Amazon, all these cities are bidding to try to get them to come in, and yet we're not even represented in the boardroom. And so I think that's also a critical question that we have to ask ourselves. And I use the example of, it wasn't until I think 2014 that Apple brought their first African-American board director, who's James Bell, who was former CFO of Boeing. But you think about that demographic who utilizes their products and services. And so if we just collectively said, if we're not represented in the boardroom, then we are not going to utilize your service or your products. I mean, it's just starting there where you don't have to have resources to do that. But the unfortunate part is a lot of us are not even aware.
So I'm struck by a couple things on this panel that have drawn me in a couple directions, and I want to make this a last question, but I'll also ask you at the end, after this question, then to give any closing thoughts that each of you have. So when we think about the work at the center, we are, I said earlier, relentlessly pursuing an economy that works for everyone. And while we realize there are a lot of people who believe in inclusion and who believe that all people were created equal, a lot of people also believe, but things kind of just got here this way by, I don't know, chance. And struggle with believing that, or even people who might believe that past decisions were made that got us to this point, we still wrestle with, but wait a minute, am I making decisions today that keep these inequities on the books, that keep people of color where they are and keep whites where they are, that keep even the gaps that exist within communities of color, that keep us continuing in a state of wealth inequality, of income inequality, that struggle with wrestling with that. And we believe strongly that it does take not just yearly action, but daily actions to reverse the actions of the day before that got us either to a worse place or at the very best kept us, right, at the level of inequality that we had last year, the level of inequity that we had last year. So I ask you all to think about, when you think about this conversation we've had here and the work that you do, what does it take? What will it take right here in Minnesota? For leaders who are wrestling with themselves and saying, I want to be a part of the solution, I am a part of the solution, what does it take?
I think for us as a foundation, again, going back to the overarching theme of intentionality, when I give out grants to nonprofit institutions or even for-profit or local city government, it's also holding them accountable. So it's saying, it's not saying, okay, well, I want you to recruit a diverse work pool. It's, I looked at the individuals that you've recruited and I don't see any person of color. Oh, well, I can't find a qualified candidate. Well, then I don't think that this is a good fit because this doesn't fit our mission. And so I think, it is an awkward conversation, and I think that you can have it in a very thoughtful way, but, you can't talk about, wanting to be inclusive and make investments and really, try to close this gap and not be intentional about holding people accountable in these positions of power when they have the actual ability to, make these hiring decisions. So it's interesting because, we have these conversations all the time, but again, all of us within our own respective organizations can be intentional about the way that we're, moving forward. We can go and ask that question of, why have we not been able to find a quality minority candidate to fill this position? Okay, well then I'm going to be intentional about combing my networks or combing someone else's. So again, I think it goes back to, we can actually make this happen. We just have to really want to, and it's, again, not the surface level Minnesota nice. It sounds good while we're in here, and having these also once a year, it's an everyday thing.
And I'll jump onto that too. We have to keep challenging the system that's in place right now, the external forces that are around us. These decisions have been made for a long period of time. But the other thing that I want us to make sure that we're focused on is building infrastructure within our communities, because the change that we want is coming from within. So we can break that system down, but if we're not ready to walk through that door, we're going to miss out on a huge opportunity. So making sure that as we challenge those systems, we're building up what we want, building up the things that we need, and building up the people and the leaders and organizations that are going to deliver it for us. So be mindful of both sides of the coin on this one.
Yeah, I would echo Marcus' sentiment. I think when we're talking about ensuring healthy communities and sustainable returns, when I think about healthy, I always tell people that I have two very specific derivative definitions for healthy. One is balance and the other is equity. In terms of our internal infrastructure, and we can kind of transpose that to external. But from a balance standpoint, for me, I define it as a weighted formula that denotes holistic modeling and ensures that trade-off implications are understood when you're confronted with constraints. I'll rest with that for a little bit because I think it applies at an individual level, an organizational level, and a community level. So in some of the work that we're doing around data collection and assessment, I sure hope it's reinforcing the concept of balance, because individually, we're not just, we're in a capitalistic society, but we're not just about finances, even though that's the way things tend to get measured by cost and value. It's usually a lagging indicator to what's happening in other areas of our humanity, spiritually, physically, emotionally, mentally, and how do those come together in a holistic formula that has to be weighted, because you're not always able to do all of this in abundance. In the hereafter we will, because whatever deity you believe in, but down here there's some constraints. So you really have to understand that balanced equation as an individual. I love to see asset maps from trusted places who are engaging with individuals and families to produce that forward. Where are people in all of those areas in that balanced formula, and where do they want to be? Same thing is true about organizations. In my organization, if I have one too many advanced strategic thinkers, not much gets done. Because honestly, strategy has to be balanced with marketing and business development, balanced with operations, balanced with finance. So what is the weighted formula inside of organizations that make for a healthy organization? Let's bring those maps on an asset basis forward as well. Where are we and where do we want to be? Same thing about community. As much as I know it's about economy and housing and entrepreneurship and income inside of the economy model, it doesn't work without a balance of social environment, natural environment, education and literacy, health and wellness, etc. Bring those asset maps forward in the form of the kind of dashboards that we already tied to at a regional level, right? Everybody knows the regional indicators dashboard, I'm sure, and the center is doing great work at trying to bring some of those asset maps forward, because I think that's an important part of what we're trying to do. From an equity standpoint, I define that as a stewardship measurement, and it needs to ensure that there's a positive correlation between access, mobility, and influence, and the depth and breadth of an individual, organization, or community's dreams, competence, and discipline. And it can't be cafeteria shop, because we do need to take time dimensions into account, like the example you made about Rondo. But I will tell you something, the concept of us not having assets is already where we've lost the game. We do have all we need already. You don't need to go get it outside of our communities. That is something that is a fallacy to me. And I'm gonna give you an anecdotal example about how equity in the stewardship measurement isn't happening to the extent that it should. So we did a survey 5 years ago of 30,000 businesses that are minority owned, ethnic minority owned, under $1 million, under 10 employees. 30,000 people in the survey. It's a response rate of 90%. First off, that's off the charts for anybody doing a data survey, right? 27,000 respondents. I'm convinced they did it because they were inspired by we were the ones giving it, because there was an aspirational connection there. But 27,000. And we asked 4 questions. Number 1, do you have a website? Of which 96% said, yes, we do. And then we went and spot checked some of them to make sure. And that made sense to me, because it's kind of the MVP product in business, like the business card used to be. The second question we asked them was, why do you have a website? And of which 99% said they had a website. Why? Why would you have a website? To generate revenue. Most people have the website because they want to make a brand awareness so that ultimately they can sell something, right? So yet 99% said because I wanted to generate revenue. Third question, how effective is the website in generating you revenue? 96% said, I don't know. I don't know. So in an investment model that's set up with, hey, here's what I want to get out of it, here I'm doing something affiliated with it, I have no idea of its effectiveness, and nobody's helping me to understand if it is effective. Here's the fourth question, and maybe this is a big piece to hit home. How much do people pay over 5 years for the website's construction and maintenance? What do you think that number was on average? Say it again, Trista. $10,635. And I promise I didn't give her the answer before. That's just her being smart. Get to know Trista Harris. $10,635. If you did that divided by the 5 years in a normalized distribution, that's an average of $2,127, even though everybody in the room knows you spend more to develop it than you do to maintain it. But let's just take the $2,127 as an example. I'll wait, my math guy, what's your name? Scott. $2,127 per year for 5 years. $2,127 doesn't seem like anything, right? In the normal conversation about business development and trying to generate revenue. But take that number times 27,000. I'll wait while you do the quick math. Yeah, well, how much? Yeah, it's $63 million per year for 5 years. 63 times 5. Now, I know you can get that one. Yeah. $315 million. Now, I just want you to know, there almost every single philanthropic organization that's a part of trying to deliver services could benefit from a $315 million investment partner who, oh, by the way, is spending the money, and all the money is predominantly going down the drain because they have no clue whatsoever what the return model looks like. That's bad stewardship. The leaders who are a part of talking about trying to be transformational, philanthropic organizations, private organizations, and others, who's coming to say, we're going to help you be more intentional with the return, and I'm just giving you websites. You can go find more of those type of assets and investments that already exist, because most of the people who talk about businesses that are under 1 million and under 10 employees define them as micro. And typically think they better go find a big, large corporation to do something for them in order for them to be able to create wealth, or a middle market company to do something for them to go on and create wealth. What about the $315 million, that example, and others, because I'm sure you can get there quickly, who's saying those assets we're going to ensure a market rate return to? Now that's when we really are going to be transformational. And that's my point about, in this pedagogy model, stop looking outside. To your point, stop looking externally to fix what's there. I'm convinced that black and brown people in this country, we have assets. I know that black folks got our talented 10th because I sit in the fraternity of them. The truth of the matter is we haven't been great enough stewards of our own assets. And that's when we do that, then we're going to start seeing the change, because then we'll know our price. And then we can go demand large-scale engagements from the rest of the marketplace.
I don't want to follow that. I believe in everything that Ravi said, because I do think that that is true, and then some, right? And I think the question for all of us, Indigenous and people of color, is how will we actually work with each other, right? We had a tiny bill this past legislative session that sort of took all of that data that said, why is it so problematic that we keep talking about racial disparities in the state, yet when we look at the organizations who really help communities of color navigate and serve the communities are like barely surviving, right? Because we are depending on a charity model for, everyone to invest in us, and we're not making the system invest in us, right? So we had tiny bills saying this wasn't about Cal, because we put ourselves, it was outside of us, but we said, well, what does it look like if we fight for each other, right? And how do we go ask and say that these organizations are small business employers, because my own experience and other people's experience that I know don't get the kind of leadership when they go and work for white mainstream institutions that they get when they run their own institutions in their own communities. And why aren't we thinking about these organizations as employers, as leadership trainers for their own communities, and really important anchors are institutions that should be built up in their organizations. So we put forth and created this infrastructure program asking the legislature to say, you can't keep talking about this if you're really not going to build us up, right? And so a lot of people said, well, why are you doing this? Because you're Asian American, don't you just want to ask for yourself? And we said, no, right? Because what does asking for ourselves do if we're not making sure that other people are coming along with us, right? So we did it, and now it funds over 21 organizations across the state. And you know, a few Asian American organizations are in that mix, but I think that we have to blow that up in a bigger way, right? To say, you know, what is our shared liberation? Is that too radical? Right? In this work, because otherwise, if we keep playing the race to the bottom card, then none of us are going to win, right? And when I think about the Asian American community, this is such a critical time because our community is being used as a wedged community in the economics issue, right? They're sort of saying, well, we don't have to worry about the people that are failing out of education because we could just bring people from China and India and, you know, because they're going to fill this gap, right? And to me, that's like everything wrong with our system and why we need to make sure that we have a much more robust conversation about all of our communities. And we have to link all of these issues, right? Economics just does not happen because we have money. We have a set of policies that determine, and our community is scared right now because they're scared about citizenship, they're scared about, even if they're highly educated workers, now they're being forbidden from bringing their spouses. They don't know if their visas will be renewed, and then you have refugees who are like, sorry, doors closing on you, right? And so I just think that how do we allow for complication in our discussions, but also what is the shared liberation, right? What is that for all of us, and how are we going to actually have these more complex conversations? Because if we don't do that, then the system's going to beat us every time, right? Because it's so easy to say, sorry, not you this time, right? You're not the population that is, you know, of the moment. So you'll get your 10 seconds maybe in 5 years, or things like that. So,
I mean,
yeah.
and I haven't gone back and done that survey. We probably should do it again, Tawana, actually, because there were, I think, 1,700 Minnesota firms in that survey.
Wow.
And so that's 1,700 times 2,000. I believe that number gets us to like $3.5 million per year for 5 years, which my math is like 17.5 million. And so as I think about the transformational work that Tawana has tried to found this Center for Economic Inclusion around, and I think about being on her board and the type of stuff that we have to do around raising money, that we should be thinking about them as assets and saying, this is transformational work. Maybe we can be better stewards in returning market rate returns to places that we're already spending money. Because that $3.5 million on an annual basis, I believe, is about 50% of what our budget looks like. And I'm saying, in lieu of the fights that we always have to go do that, maybe we should turn our attention to a couple more innovative ways to think about who's our partners.
Right, absolutely. Equity at its finest. At its finest. Last word, Dr. Perry.
I'm going to give you a shout out similarly. There's opportunity to advance racial equity, financial opportunity, as was mentioned. Your job, you know, to put it plainly, is to make people of color money. And you've got to be disciplined in a way that I think, as you suggested, there are plenty of opportunities for us to leverage current existing assets. Because what I don't want to see is us continuously trying to make the head case to people who don't see value where there is obvious value. You know, it just goes nowhere. And if there, you know, I also believe you should invest in analytics. To your point, there are many researchers who have the same biases as the business leaders here, and so it can be Knight funding my research on assets, but more importantly, it is about making sure we have the actual knowledge for you to make strategic decisions around how to make people of color money. And what's interesting about this, we've built up these walls of ignorance, is that white folk can make money by making black people money. But our biases are so strong that we continuously see any kind of investment in black and brown people as charity. We don't even, it's not an investment in so many ways. And so, but for me, I do think you have an organization here that is deliberate about bringing inclusion economically, and that might be crass by saying making people of color money, but I don't have a problem with saying that. And so get those analytics, but more importantly, make sure you just don't waste time with people who have no interest in seeing value in people of color.
This did not disappoint me 1 ounce, and I hope that it did not you either. I can tell from your attention that it did not. A huge thank you to Dr. Perry and to each of our esteemed panelists for joining us today, and to each of you. But you are not only on the hook for coming today and for listening and then going out there and eating and drinking and socializing. You are on the hook for action. You are on the hook for actions tomorrow that are different than the actions you took today and yesterday. Even those of you who would call yourselves the greatest advocates and activists for economic inclusion, those of you who are people of color and those of you who are not, you are on the hook. It requires each one of us to do things differently. It requires me to do things differently every day. The comments that you just gave, Dr. Perry, were directly to my soul. They are convicting because it requires holding people accountable in my seat in ways that even this bold woman who gets called for, did she say that again? Oh my gosh, did she actually say that again in Minnesota? I think Kristen, my COO in the back, says frequently, like, okay, the roller coaster is starting, all right, she's warming up, we're about to go down that big tall hill. Even in my seat, having now declared that it is our job to make people of color money, the stakes have gone up times 100, not just times 10. And people are quite uncomfortable with the stakes and the conversations, and yet for me it's not about conversations, it's about creating an economy that actually works for everyone in this region. Being the first region that has an organization who has this exclusive mission, you have an opportunity to tell us what does it take, but more than that, you have an opportunity to tell us what you're going to do and how we can support you in that work that is community-driven and data-informed, data-supported. So we ask you to leave here committing, thinking about the commitments that you heard throughout this panel. Each one of our speakers talked to you about the commitments that they're making inside their own organization, from hiring and thinking drastically different about who they hire and bring inside their organizations, to investments, how they invest in other organizations, how they invest in talent, how they invest in communities with a completely different lens than they've had historically, how they challenge others, their peers, their partners to think differently about investments and return. To narrative, what is the narrative that you carry out of here? Many of you are tweeting, I see my iPad lighting up constantly, but how do you go beyond that? What conversations will you have tonight at dinner? Often we have great conversations with our peers in work and never have conversations about this with the people we call family. What conversations will you have about the data that you heard today? Not just the statistical data, though that was important, but the stories that you heard that weigh just as much about the experiences that your fellow Minnesotans have as your fellow Minnesotans. How do you change the narrative about what it takes to build an economy that is inclusive in this region and about the fact that we have an exclusive economy today? How will you change that narrative by the way that you walk and talk at home, in your neighborhoods, at work, in your place of worship? Should that be the place that you interact? In your gym, at your children's school, with your children, because by gosh, it takes changing this very early. Because as a mother of a 5- and 7-year-old, I can tell you that they experience this exclusive economy much earlier than I wish that they did, which requires each of you to begin talking to your children much earlier than you choose to about the things that they observe. So I ask you, when you go out those doors and begin eating and drinking and socializing, make sure that you don't just talk about what you heard, but you talk about what you're going to do. Those of you who were at our May launch know that we asked you to fill out commitment cards. Yes, you got yours, thank you. Some of you turned those in to us. I'm gonna ask you to revisit those. They give you specific options, but it also gives you an opportunity to write in your own. What commitments will you make, and what commitments will you ask others to make inside their own homes and organizations? This takes committing not just from 8 to 5, but committing from 5 to 11 too. Thank you so very much for joining us. If you have not registered already for our November event with Arlen Hamilton, as you mentioned, please do so. Please share what you learned today out in your communities, and thank you so much for joining us today.